The dark side of always being the peacemaker. There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that lives inside those who spend their lives smoothing the world for others. A tiredness that doesn't shout. It settles like dust in the corners of a heart that has learned to breathe softly, speak gently, and take up as little space as possible, just to keep the room from breaking. People admire the peacemaker. They praise their patience, their calm, their ability to dissolve storms before thunder can form. But what they don't see is the invisible cost. The silent swallowing of needs, the fear of conflict that shapes entire identities, the loneliness of being the one who must always hold everything together. This is the story of that hidden burden, and the emotional truth behind always being the one who never asks for peace of their own. There comes a point in every peacemaker's life when they quietly begin to notice the weight of their own silence. It often arrives slowly, like a soft bruise beneath the skin, small, dull, almost invisible to anyone else, but unmistakably tender when touched. A moment when they catch themselves apologizing for things they didn't do, softening truths that deserve to be spoken, or shrinking their presence just to ensure everyone else remains comfortable. This is where recognition begins. Not in a dramatic confrontation, not in a sudden burst of rebellion, but in a fragile, private awareness. Why do I always bend first? Most peacemakers don't remember choosing the role. They simply grew into it the way a vine grows toward the nearest source of light. Over the years, they perfected the art of easing a room, reading faces before words were spoken, adjusting their tone before tension could form, absorbing discomfort before conflict could erupt. People often mistook this for kindness, maturity, emotional wisdom. And in many ways it was. But beneath the smooth surface lived an unacknowledged truth. Peacekeeping had never been optional. It was a guardianship they carried without being asked, a role assigned not by desire but by necessity. And so the mask formed. A mask made not of deception but of restraint. A practiced gentleness. A carefully measured smile that signaled to the world, "Don't worry, I'll keep everything calm." The peacemaker becomes the one who reassures, who diffuses, who mediates. Their voice is the soft landing after someone else's hard words. Their presence the buffer between other people's storms. They learn to swallow discomfort with the fluidity of someone who has done it thousands of times. It becomes instinctive, like tightening one's grip before a fall. But what no one sees is the quiet erosion happening beneath. The way the peacemaker's needs are first delayed, then dismissed, then forgotten altogether. Not by others, but by themselves. It's the small things that reveal the truth. The way they apologize when someone else bumps into them. The way they say, "It's fine," before they have time to feel whether it truly is. The way they interpret their own preferences as inconveniences, their boundaries as burdens, their emotions as disruptions to a fragile harmony they feel responsible to protect. There is a moment, sometimes years later, when they finally pause long enough to look at the pattern. They notice the script they recite unconsciously, the reassuring nod, the gentle reply, the quiet willingness to step aside. They see how often they contort themselves to be agreeable, digesting words they wish they had spoken, diluting parts of themselves until only the most harmless version remains. They see the mask for what it has always been. A shield that kept the world comfortable at the cost of their own comfort. Recognition is both soft and painful. It is the realization that the person others admire is also the person who has never felt fully seen. The calm they are praised for is also the silence they long to escape. The tolerance others depend on is also the boundary that has never been allowed to exist. And yet, in this quiet second of awareness, something shifts. Just slightly. Like a curtain moving in a breeze. Because once the mask is seen, it can no longer be worn without question. The peacemaker starts to wonder, what would happen if I stopped cushioning every impact? Would the world truly fall apart? Or have I been protecting it from storms that were never mine to calm? They don't answer these questions yet. Not in this chapter. For now, recognition is enough. An awakening that does not need to be loud to be real. A soft beginning. This is the first step of the story, the moment when the peacemaker finally sees the quiet, emotional architecture of the role they've been living in for so long. A role that once felt natural, now starting to feel unbearably small. The roots of the peacemaker run deep. They stretch into quiet corners of childhood, into rooms where silence was measured in tension and approval was conditional. Long before words like personality or role were understood, they learned a simple truth. The world only feels safe when others are calm. And so, from the earliest days they began to carry that responsibility. Some children grow up in homes where anger arrives suddenly, like a storm that bends the furniture and reddens faces. The peacemaker learns to anticipate the clouds, to read the first tremors in a parent's voice, to soften their own presence before the first clap of thunder. Others witness emotional distance rather than eruptions, where love feels fragile and must be carefully negotiated. Affection is not freely given, but earned by compliance, by deference, by shrinking just enough to avoid rejection. In both cases, the lesson is the same. Peacekeeping is survival. It is a subtle education disguised as care. A child notices what is unsaid more than what is said. They memorize the cues of tension, the small shifts in posture, the expressions that signal danger or approval. They learn to be small when anger arises, quiet when disappointment hovers, invisible when need arises, not just their own but everyone else's. It becomes a skill, almost an instinct, one that carries into adulthood like a hidden organ, silently sustaining life but never fully recognized. Early experiences teach more than behavior. They teach identity. By the time adolescence arrives, many peacemakers no longer distinguish between their own desires and the avoidance of conflict. To want openly is to risk friction. To express discomfort is to risk disapproval. So they learn to negotiate space and emotion with the care of a diplomat, not realizing that their own interior life is slowly bending beneath the weight of constant mediation. There is also a strange form of praise in this formation. Adults, friends, and siblings admire the calm one, the one who never complains, the one who diffuses fights with a gentle word or a measured smile. "Thank you for keeping the peace," they hear, often without malice. And the child believes it. They associate self-worth with their ability to prevent storms, to absorb discomfort, to be what the world needs rather than what they are. And yet, somewhere beneath the adaptation, a quiet question lingers. A small, persistent tug. Is this who I am, or who I have learned to be? Most never give voice to it. It is easier, safer, more familiar to remain the one who makes others comfortable than to risk the chaos of asserting themselves. So the peacemaker learns a delicate balancing act. Survival through silence, approval through compliance, peace through self-erasure. The origins are rarely dramatic, rarely cinematic in a conventional sense. They are whispers, shadows, small everyday moments that teach the mind and body how to survive in the landscape of emotional volatility. It is why the peacemaker does not choose this path consciously. They inherit it from experience, from necessity, from the early recognition that harmony is a currency worth every sacrifice. And so, what begins as a protective measure becomes a defining pattern. The child grows into the adult who cushions every word, softens every truth, and bears the quiet weight of unspoken needs. They become fluent in the language of emotional diplomacy, their skill admired, their exhaustion invisible. The seeds of self-neglect have been planted long ago, rooted in the need to protect, to survive, to love safely. Recognition in adulthood may awaken the awareness of this legacy. But the origin remains vital. Because understanding where it began is not blame. It is context. It is the first step in seeing that the role of the peacemaker, while protective and compassionate, has never been entirely theirs to carry, and that understanding it is the beginning of a different kind of freedom. The peacemaker's life is lived in quiet patterns of adaptation, often invisible even to themselves. Beneath the surface of their calm exterior lies a nervous system finely tuned to detect disapproval, conflict, or tension. Every raised voice, every frown, every sigh registers not just as an external event, but as a subtle signal that survival may require immediate adjustment. It is a form of hypervigilance born from necessity, a skill perfected through repetition and years of conditioning. Psychologists have observed this tendency in what is often called fawning behavior, a deep, instinctive drive to appease those around them in order to maintain safety. It is an unconscious strategy, rooted in attachment theory, where early relationships teach that love and protection are conditional. When the environment signals that anger or disagreement is dangerous, the child learns to submit, to soften, to anticipate the needs of others before their own. Over time, this survival mechanism becomes a habitual framework for interacting with the world. Fawning is subtle. It is not rebellion nor overt avoidance. It is an internal negotiation of presence and desire. The peacemaker constantly measures. Will this word cause a ripple? Will this opinion create friction? They become skilled at predicting emotional outcomes, at minimizing their own visibility in favor of collective stability. This is why peacemakers are often praised for patience, empathy, or maturity, qualities that disguise the silent cost of constant self-monitoring. The consequences of this hypervigilance are profound. Boundaries are rarely asserted, and when they are, guilt often follows. Needs, both small and large, are postponed or abandoned entirely. The nervous system, accustomed to prioritizing external harmony over internal equilibrium, begins to encode discomfort as a norm. Resentment quietly becomes part of the emotional landscape. Cognitive psychology also explains the phenomenon of self-erasure through learned helplessness. Repeatedly suppressing one's own desires to prevent conflict reinforces the belief that personal feelings are secondary, or even dangerous. The mind comes to expect that asserting oneself will lead to rejection, criticism, or emotional upheaval. So the peacemaker quietly erases preferences, opinions, and impulses, often without conscious realization, constructing a personality that exists primarily in service of others. Emotional intelligence, ironically, becomes a double-edged sword. Peacemakers can read moods, anticipate reactions, and adjust behaviors with near precognitive skill. They are empathic in ways that seem effortless, able to soothe arguments, deflect tension, and calm storms. Yet this very capacity, when unbalanced, fosters disconnection from their own emotions. The more attuned they are to others, the less attuned they become to themselves. Even self-compassion is difficult to sustain. The internal dialogue often mirrors external dynamics. If I stay silent, all will be well. If I assert myself, someone might be hurt. The peacemaker grows accustomed to sacrificing self-interest for the comfort of others, reinforcing the internalized belief that their own voice is less valuable. This pattern repeats across relationships, work, family, and friendships, creating a life that, to the outside observer, appears harmonious, but inwardly feels constrained, muted, and heavy. The psychology of self-erasure explains why so many peacemakers reach adulthood carrying exhaustion they cannot name. It clarifies the invisible mechanics behind their constant striving for approval, their automatic conflict avoidance, and their quiet internal negotiation of presence. It is a blueprint for understanding the emotional tension that has shaped their identity, a tension that will only deepen if unexamined, yet one that also opens the possibility for awareness, change, and gentler self-recognition. Recognition of this pattern is not a moral reckoning. It is not about guilt. It is observation, careful, compassionate, and reflective, like noticing the structure of a hidden garden. Once seen, the psychological framework of self-erasure can begin to loosen, giving space for insight, clarity, and eventually, for the peacemaker to consider a life where their own needs are allowed to exist alongside the harmony they cherish. Within the peacemaker, a quiet contradiction hums like a hidden river. They crave connection, warmth, and intimacy, yet recoil when closeness might demand confrontation. They long for honesty, vulnerability, and recognition, yet fear that speaking their truth will fracture the fragile equilibrium they have worked so diligently to maintain. This is the inner split, a tension between desire and duty, between self and the world. The split is not sudden. It begins as small hesitations, pausing before expressing an opinion, softening a statement, muting emotion to avoid stirring discomfort. Over time, these compromises accumulate, forming an invisible chasm between what is felt inside and what is expressed outside. The peacemaker becomes fluent in the language of appeasement, while their own feelings reside in the shadow of necessity, quieted and deferred. Emotionally, this creates a subtle form of dysregulation. Resentment builds quietly, like sediment beneath flowing water. A comment left unspoken, a preference left unvoiced, a boundary left uncrossed, each contributes to a slow erosion of internal coherence. The heart begins to recognize a pattern. The self is divided, and while one part negotiates peace in the external world, the other retreats into invisibility, longing for acknowledgement and care. This inner conflict can take on almost paradoxical forms. A peacemaker might smile while feeling irritation, laugh while feeling hurt, or nod in agreement while silently rebelling. Their empathy is genuine, yet it functions as a shield, not only for others but also for themselves, keeping raw feelings at bay. In effect, the split ensures survival and relational harmony, but at the cost of authenticity and emotional intimacy with oneself. The tension also manifests physiologically. Psychologists observe that chronic conflict avoidance activates the stress response system repeatedly, even when danger is only perceived. Cortisol levels rise, muscles tighten, the nervous system remains alert. The body learns to prioritize external safety over internal comfort, teaching the peacemaker to tolerate subtle suffering as a normal state. The inner split is not just emotional, it is woven into the very architecture of the mind and body. Socially, the consequences ripple outward. Relationships may appear smooth, yet lack the depth that arises from true reciprocity. Others appreciate the peacemaker's stability, reliability, and patience, often without recognizing the emotional labor required to sustain it. They are valued for the calm they provide, not for the unexpressed storm within. This imbalance perpetuates the split, reinforcing the habit of self-erasure and prolonging the quiet suffering beneath the surface. The inner split is also existential. It asks unspoken questions. Who am I beyond this role? What would it feel like to be seen fully, without having to cushion or accommodate? For many peacemakers, these questions remain unarticulated for years, hovering at the edge of consciousness like distant stars, visible yet seemingly unreachable. The mind negotiates between longing for authenticity and the fear of destabilizing the carefully constructed world. Yet the split, paradoxically, contains the seeds of insight. By acknowledging the tension, the peacemaker begins to see the landscape of their own interior life, the patterns, compromises, and sacrifices that define it. Recognition of the inner split is not the end of discomfort. It is the threshold of awareness, the moment when reflection becomes possible, and the quiet yearning for integration begins to stir. For the first time, they glimpse a life where the external calm need not demand internal erasure. The path forward is not clear, but the recognition itself is profound. The self is divided, and only by noticing the division can reconciliation, gentle, compassionate, and patient, begin. There is a quiet evening when the realization comes. Not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, steady dawn breaking inside the chest. The peacemaker, who has carried so much unspoken tension, so many swallowed words, begins to feel the weight of all those invisible burdens pressing at once. A conversation that should have been simple leaves the heart sore. A small disagreement triggers disproportionate fatigue. And in that stillness, a question rises like mist. Have I ever asked for peace for myself? The realization is often startling because it is silent. It does not announce itself with drama. It slips quietly into awareness while the world continues in its usual rhythm. A glance in the mirror, a pause after a meeting, the lingering ache at the end of a long day, these are the moments when the peacemaker recognizes the cost of constant appeasement, the exhaustion of invisibility, the erosion of self. It is an awakening to the subtle truth that harmony has been maintained at their own expense, and that no one else may notice the quiet toll. There is also an emotional intensity to this recognition. Years of deferred needs and muted desires converge into a single, undeniable clarity. Resentment surfaces, not as anger toward others, but as grief toward oneself for the sacrifices made silently, almost unconsciously. Loneliness, previously masked by the busyness of care and mediation, blooms with startling visibility. And underneath it all, there is fear, the fear that acknowledging these truths may unravel the relationships they have nurtured, or expose cracks they are not ready to confront. The mind begins to catalog the subtle patterns of compromise. Each apology that wasn't necessary. Each opinion softened to keep others comfortable. Each retreat from conflict, each self-neglect. The peacemaker begins to see the invisible ledger of emotional labor, the quiet tally of self-erasure that has gone unnoticed by the world, and even by themselves until this moment. Yet within this painful awareness lies clarity. The moment of realization is not just about loss, it is about insight. The peacemaker sees the intricate architecture of their own role, the way it was formed, the ways it has protected them and others, and the ways it has constrained them. It is a reflective mirror held not in judgment, but in understanding. The recognition that survival strategies developed long ago may no longer serve the life they wish to live. There is also a paradoxical relief. The peacemaker has been carrying the invisible weight for so long that acknowledging it allows space for the first breath of possibility. To see the toll clearly is to recognize that it is not immutable. To feel the exhaustion fully is to understand that boundaries can exist without harm, that honesty need not destroy harmony, and that their own peace is as vital as the peace they create for others. This moment does not resolve everything. It does not instantly dissolve years of patterns. But it is pivotal. It is the threshold between unconscious survival and conscious presence, between silent accommodation and thoughtful self-awareness. It is the emotional pivot where the peacemaker begins to ask, if I am always responsible for others' calm, who is responsible for mine? And in that quiet, reflective pause, a gentle, almost imperceptible shift occurs. A soft recognition that the life they have been living is not the only possible life. That caring for others and caring for oneself are not mutually exclusive. That the first step toward a truer harmony may begin with simply noticing, and allowing, the self to exist fully without apology. After the realization, there is a slow, almost imperceptible turning inward. The peacemaker begins to notice the small tremors of discomfort that once passed unnoticed, tight shoulders, shallow breaths, a hollow ache behind the ribs. For years, these signals had been quietly ignored, smoothed over, or rationalized in service of others. Now they are acknowledged. Now they are allowed space. And in this noticing, the first steps toward holding one's own peace emerge. Learning to hold peace is less about grand gestures than subtle shifts. It is the permission to speak a truth softly, without reshaping it to protect the listener. It is the quiet insistence on small boundaries, declining a request without guilt, reserving time for rest, choosing presence for oneself as deliberately as one chooses presence for others. It is the recognition that harmony is not diminished when the self is included. In fact, it deepens. The process is uneven, filled with hesitation and doubt. Old patterns resurface. A familiar urge arises to soften a statement, to erase discomfort, to anticipate others' reactions before noticing one's own. Yet each act of gentle self-assertion becomes a lesson in possibility, a proof that peace can exist without sacrifice, that boundaries are not betrayals, and that asserting one's own needs need not fracture relationships. Psychologically, this stage engages a slow retraining of the nervous system. The body and mind, conditioned for hypervigilance, learn to tolerate presence without constant appeasement. Neural pathways of self-neglect gradually weaken, while pathways of recognition, care, and emotional attunement toward the self grow stronger. The peacemaker discovers that their nervous system, once wired to smooth every tension, can begin to accept that some unrest is natural, manageable, and even instructive. Emotionally, holding one's own peace feels like a reclamation. The peacemaker begins to notice their desires, their moods, and their limits, not as luxuries but as intrinsic aspects of being human. They see that self-care is not indulgence, but an acknowledgement of value, a recognition that the work of sustaining others is more sustainable when the self is not invisible. Empathy remains, but it is no longer self-erasing. Compassion for others now coexists with compassion for oneself. Relationships shift subtly as well. Others may initially react with surprise when a boundary is drawn or a preference is expressed. Yet over time, the rhythm of reciprocity recalibrates. People begin to see the peacemaker not just as a buffer, but as a complete presence, capable of kindness and calm, yet also fully human, fully felt, fully themselves. Trust, respect, and intimacy deepen when the self is present rather than perpetually absent. Learning to hold peace is not a destination. It is a lifelong practice of attention, reflection, and gentle courage. It is the art of listening to the body, honoring the mind, and attending to the heart, even when silence or self-sacrifice once felt safer. It is a reclamation of agency, the quiet assertion that one's own serenity is not negotiable, because it is foundational, not optional. And in this subtle, meditative process, the peacemaker discovers a new rhythm. Harmony is no longer one-sided. The inner world, once suppressed, finds its voice alongside the external. The self is no longer a shadow behind others' needs, but a participant in the quiet dance of presence. And in that dance, peace becomes sustainable, authentic, and shared, without loss, without erasure, without compromise of the soul. There comes a day when the peacemaker begins to feel at home in their own presence. Not loudly, not in a declaration of triumph, but in the subtle, steady rhythm of being seen, by themselves first and then gradually by the world around them. It is a quiet homecoming, a return to a self they had known only in fragments, glimpsed between the spaces of others' needs, softened by years of careful restraint. The landscape of inner life, once a series of negotiated compromises, begins to unfold with gentle clarity. They notice the cadence of their thoughts, the texture of emotions that were long deferred, the simple pleasure of acknowledging a preference without apology. The mind, previously trained to anticipate others' discomfort, learns to tolerate its own. The heart, once cautious, begins to feel the warmth of recognition, not conditional, not contingent, but inherent. Relationships too shift with quiet resonance. Those around the peacemaker sense a subtle change, a presence that is whole, neither overbearing nor absent, simply complete. The peacemaker no longer disappears behind the labor of keeping others calm. Connection deepens when honesty and authenticity replace the practiced mask of perpetual mediation. The world does not collapse. The storms do not rage. Instead, harmony gains a new dimension, one enriched by the inclusion of the self. There is a profound poetry in this transformation. It is the recognition that peace, true peace, cannot be fully given unless it is also received internally. The act of maintaining calm for others is not diminished by attending to one's own needs. It is, in fact, strengthened. Empathy becomes not a burden, but a freely extended bridge between hearts. Compassion radiates outward without depleting the source. The homecoming is also an acceptance of imperfection. Boundaries may still be tested, mistakes still made, and discomfort still experienced. But the peacemaker now navigates these experiences with awareness, grace, and self-compassion. They understand that being whole does not require the absence of tension, only the ability to inhabit it fully without losing oneself. Memory of the old self lingers, not as regret but as testament. The years of silence, of appeasement, of hidden labor are honored as the foundation from which growth arises. They were not wasted, for they forged sensitivity, empathy, and resilience. Yet they are no longer a mandate, they are now a choice. In the final reflection, the peacemaker realizes that peace is not a possession or a role. It is a presence, a way of inhabiting the world that includes the self as fully as it includes others. It is the soft confidence that boundaries can coexist with connection, that honesty can coexist with harmony, that self-care can coexist with care for others. And in this quiet realization, the heart finds rest. The journey of always being the peacemaker is not erased. It is reframed. It becomes a story of learning, of insight, and of the delicate art of integration. A story where the quiet labor of the past informs the wisdom of the present. Where the self, once invisible, now resides at the center of the circle it has long sought to protect. And in that soft, meditative return, peace is no longer an external achievement or a borrowed role. It is home. A home that has always been within, waiting to be recognized, honored, and held.